This meeting is being recorded.
Bonsoir, good evening. My name is Karen Devonish Mazzota, and I am a French as a second language teacher with the Toronto District School Board. I'm also a teacher librarian and a course director and practicum facilitator with the Faculty of Education at York University, working with the bilingual Glendon cohort of new French as a second language teachers.
Et bonjour tout le monde. Je devrais dire bonsoir tout le monde. Good evening. So great to see so many people here tonight. After a full day at school, we certainly appreciate you and your presence here. My name is Cecile Robertson. I'm currently a secondee at the Faculty of Education for the Glendon cohort in the FSL program. In my past life, I was a learning coach, a consultant for the TDSB in the FSL department, a researcher for the Ministry of Education, and currently in my role right now as course director, practicum facilitator at the university. And one more thing I did in the past that I'm also very proud of that I'll be returning to in the fall is being a vice principal at the TDSB. So we are absolutely thrilled to have you with us this evening. We have lots of stuff to go over and to cover. But the main thing we want to do as well is engage you in conversation. We are hoping that we'll have opportunities to connect, to talk to one another, to exchange ideas, and to really deepen our understanding of what intercultural awareness and culturally relevant pedagogy have to do with us as FSL educators. So I think we're ready to go. Do you want to go back to the first slide for just one moment? Thank you, Karen, for being the official slide person, and I'll take on that role when it's your time to speak. So we just want to remind you what this module is all about. So in this particular presentation, we will explore who we are as FSL educators and how our identities influence our pedagogies and relationships with learners. Our goal is really to make important connections between the tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy, or CRP, and intercultural understanding and awareness. So we'll move on to the next one now, please. So we would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. As we gather for this meeting physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let us take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so, recognize the various traditional lands on which we come together today. We acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging of all the land we work on and live on, and their ancestral spirits with gratitude and respect. So before we jump into our session goals, again, bienvenue, welcome. We are excited to welcome you to our session this evening. You will notice that throughout this presentation, we will be asking you lots and lots of questions that you may want to answer or maybe just think about today. The nature of this presentation is really rooted in closely examining our teaching practice, our identities as FSL educators, and the ways that we approach curriculum in the context of intercultural understanding and awareness. So we really want you to take notes if possible. So if you have a paper, a pen, or even a tablet that you can work with, that would be great. So perhaps jotting down some thoughts and ideas as we work through some of these concepts this evening. And really it's about engagement and it's about talking to each other. So we're really excited for that portion of the presentation, which we will really initiate towards the end. So let's take a moment to look at our session goals. So tonight we are reflecting on identity so that we can take account of our positionality and how identity informs FSL pedagogy and learning. We are also going to unpack the tenets of intercultural understanding, awareness, and culturally relevant pedagogy. so that we can use culturally relevant pedagogy as a pedagogical stance for supporting intercultural awareness and understanding, anti-oppressive teaching strategies, and development of a critical consciousness. Wow, that's a lot as I go through these goals here, but we're going to start the discussion tonight, hopefully. And the last goal is we are going to make connections between FSL curriculum, intercultural understanding and intercultural awareness, competence, and CRP, so that we can develop a mindset for exploring identity and culture, meaning self and others, while learning French as a second language. So before we begin, we would like to share with you really the mindset that is framing our work tonight. So we're going to give you a minute or so to read this particular slide. So throughout tonight's session, we are going to adapt and adopt an anti-oppressive framework. What is an anti-oppressive framework? Well, it is the method and process in which we understand how systems of oppression, such as colonialism, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, and ableism can result in individual discriminatory actions and structural systemic inequalities for certain groups in society. Anti-oppressive practices and goals seek to recognize and dismantle such discriminatory actions and power imbalances. And we're just going to stay there on that slide for one moment. And I really want to stress the importance of this. So for us, it's really important to adopt an anti-oppressive framework. Why? Because we want to create courageous and safe spaces where all members of a community can speak openly and freely about their lived experiences without judgment and or fear. More specifically, the anti-oppressive framework creates the conditions for us to move into the sphere of action, to challenge, confront, and dismantle the injustices and inequalities experienced by historically marginalized communities. Moving into this realm requires an open to learning stance, as well as a willingness to engage in critical work. And this is not an easy process. Let's move on to the next slide. So before we begin, to reiterate, we would like to follow the following tenets, which we call the 4 agreements of courageous conversations. So we would motivate you, hopefully through rich talk, but throughout the process, we want you to stay engaged, to speak your truth, to expect and accept discomfort, and to be open to ambiguity. So let's jump right in. Let's talk about identity. So what does identity have to do with anything? Well, I'd like to challenge you to think about identity through the work of Byram, who is quoted here, his work at the end of this slide, at the bottom of this slide. And Byram defines identity as, quote, who or what someone is, the various meanings someone can attach to oneself, or the meanings attributed to oneself by others. So as we look at Byram's work, we need to carefully unpack the complexity associated to identity. He mentions 3 aspects that are particularly relevant to us as FSL educators. In particular, how do we understand and perceive ourselves in relation to 3 specific areas, which are listed, I believe, on the slide. Number 1, the subject that we teach. Number 2, the relationship with our students. And number 3, our role or role conception. So let's take a look. We're going to stay on this slide for now. Thanks. Let's take a look at the first aspect that he talks about here, which is the subject one teaches. So as FSL teachers, we need to be aware of how our own educational trajectories as students and teachers have shaped our understanding of French. So French language, French culture. What does being an FSL teacher mean to you? What insecurities are you aware of that directly or maybe indirectly impact your teaching style? What do you choose to focus on in the curriculum, and why is that important for you? Here's a question I ask my student teachers all the time. Are you passionate about French language? Is it a subject area that you feel you can teach in ways that spark your students' imagination, their creativity, and their engagement? So lots of questions to think about indeed. We're now going to go to the next slide. And I'm going to give you a minute or so to read the questions that are posted here. And again, I hope that you have something to write with, because I'm going to ask you to choose one or two questions that particularly resonate with you. So I'll read the questions out loud to give you an opportunity maybe to think about the one that resonates for you, and also the one I think where you can make connections with your teaching practice. So the first one is, how do my personal, professional, and/or intellectual positionalities, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means later on, which encompasses identities, context, experiences, and perspectives, cohere with or diverge from FSL curriculum, expectations, and teaching practice. Here's another question that you might like. What legacies, either personal, communal, societal, national, transnational, and/or global, inform the social constructedness of my FSL positionality? And we'll go over that word positionality in a moment. In what ways or not am I consciously or not reifying, resisting, disrupting, and/or changing the constructs of my positionality in the context of FSL teaching? And the last question is, how has my own positionality changed or not over time, and why? In what ways has it remained static, and why? So we're just going to leave the slide up for another maybe 30 seconds. These are not easy questions. These are very heavy questions. But we really want you to think about it, because this is at the core of who we are and how we teach, what we teach, how we teach. These are some of the questions that are directly related to identity. And as you jot some of these questions down, we can also go over, if you're not sure about exactly what we're looking for, we can also expand on that a little bit later on. Okay, we're going to be moving on to the next slide. So now we're going to make connections between identity and positionality. So when we talk about positionality, we have to understand that no education is politically neutral. And this really comes from the work of Paulo Freire and bell hooks in particular. And so how does this notion of positionality relate to teacher identity? Well, the importance of one's positionality and multiple identities will shape our understandings and views of how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive others, and how we navigate the world. Let's just stay on this slide for one moment. So who you are, including all of your identities, all of your lived experiences, life exposure, realities, truths, traumas, thoughts, all of that influence how you perceive everything in the world. All of these things become a lens through which you filter everything. And so we must recognize the power of the personal lens. also known as our positionality. So let's move on to the next slide to get maybe a better or a deeper understanding. So in this slide, we see overlapping circles because we are not just defined by one thing. In fact, we see that our identities are complex and we are not limited to one aspect of our lives or lived experiences. This concept is called intersectionality. So if we take the quote that is also in this slide, it helps you understand how complex identity is and how all of these overlapping circles really influence and shape our positionality. So the way we understand and we see the world influences how we interact with others, make decisions, and interpret others' actions. To be equitable and inclusive teachers and leaders and educators, or even humans, we must understand how our identities bias our perceptions. Let's stay on this slide for a moment. In acknowledging positionality, we also acknowledge intersecting social locations and complex power dynamics. Intersectionality refers to particular forms of intersecting oppressions. For example, the intersection of race and gender, or of sexuality and nation. Intersectional paradigms remind us that oppression cannot be reduced to one fundamental type, and that oppressions work together in producing injustice. So what does this have to do with us as FSL teachers? You're probably wondering. Because at the core, I believe that my teaching methods, which are influenced by the FSL curriculum and the ways that I learn and I teach with my students or to my students, will always be infused with my personal bias, my personal limiting beliefs, and my own perspectives. How do I approach curriculum with understanding of this, an understanding of the complexity of this? How do I ensure as an FSL educator that I create and foster spaces where all voices are included, where various ways of knowing and being are at the core of valuing all of the voices, not just my own or the one that I'm most comfortable with? When you recognize your own positionality and your own multiple identities, student and teachers alike, you also develop critical consciousness and critical reflection. This means that you are engaging in conversations and dialogues that address power disparities that exist between and among our FSL students, as well as in the curriculum. And in the context of intercultural awareness is at the heart of it, la francophonie, for example. Let's move on to the next slide. So here are some more questions. So you're probably thinking, okay, this lady is pushing us tonight with these questions, more questions. So take a look at these questions. The first one, what considerations are there for teaching and learning when working with students of diverse experiences and backgrounds than ourselves? And what considerations are there for teaching and learning when working with students of similar experiences and backgrounds than ourselves? So taking a look at these questions helps to what I like to call a decentering process, to decenter yourself. So this slide speaks to the notion of making, for example, assumptions, right? So assumptions about our students who may be different from us or who may be similar to us. So assumptions can feed into a need to act on what we think we know about our students, as opposed to actually taking the time to know. So teachers, like all humans, make assumptions on a daily basis, right? Our brains are wired to look for patterns and to operate on assumptions. Sometimes, though, those assumptions can be very harmful. So what we assume about our students who look like us or who maybe are different from us, their families, can actually impede sometimes growth and learning. And I'm going to list A few reasons why this is true. Because when we operate of a place where we believe in our assumptions about students who look like us or who are different from us, we limit their potential. So our students in FSL have potential beyond what we can see. Sometimes we let our experience limit our perceptions of their potential. Here's another thing to think about. We think they know things that they don't. So when we assume that students come into our classroom with a specific set of skills and we become frustrated when they don't, it's easy to place blame on their family, their families, their past teachers, or the students themselves. But placing blame doesn't do any good. So instead of blaming, we need to be flexible and adapt to where our students are in FSL program. When we make assumptions about families, for example, uninvolved parents. So if parents don't come to the school often, well, we might assume that they don't care about their child's education. We never know someone's circumstances. Maybe that parent is working 3 jobs and can't make it to school. We assume that parents who don't help their kids with homework don't care or don't see the value in education. But maybe they can't do the work themselves, or they don't speak English or French well enough to help their child. So making assumptions is easy. It's much harder to be compassionate and understanding. And the last thing to think about with this slide is when we make assumptions about students, particularly the ones who are different than us or who look like us, we really, I would say, are biased in favor of our ways of thinking. And it's easy to assume that others think as we do, but everyone has bias or preconceived ideas about those that are different and sometimes similar to us. So having biases and making assumptions doesn't make us bad teachers, but it makes us human. But the only way to combat these biases is to be aware of them and to actively work to change them. So I'm now going to invite my esteemed colleague to do the second half of tonight's presentation.
Thanks, Cecile. Thank you so much. I think you made an excellent argument for how these conversations about teacher identities have implications for the French as a second language context. And particularly when you think about it through an anti-oppressive framework. So think again about that slide Cecile showed you earlier, because we're going to weave those concepts through the last half of this presentation. So we know that students come to our French as a second language classes with many different experiences, from home, from friends, from community, from media fads, from all their various different interests. And if we as educators are able to understand and recognize and value our students as these myriad of complex identities and experiences, then as educators, we're better equipped to reach and teach our students and develop a culturally relevant pedagogy. We'd also be modeling for our students good intercultural competence. So we need to create French as a second language classroom cultures where all students feel like they can be themselves. They can make mistakes, ask questions, feel vulnerable, where they can be seen, heard, valued, where they can use all of their knowledge and skills to learn to communicate in the target language. If we as educators limit or devalue part of who they are, if you think about that slide Cecile showed you with the various different social identities that make up a student, if we deny part of who they are, if we regard an aspect of those personal narratives to be a deficit or a barrier to their learning, then we're not positioning ourselves to be FSL teachers who set up students for success in French learning. And as Cecile said, our own identities very much affects how we teach, who we teach, which is very much expressed in the quote that you see in front of you on the slide. So Cecile and I believe that a culturally relevant pedagogy is a stance or a position from which we can teach to support intercultural awareness and understanding in French as a second language effectively. So I'm going to tell you a little story about Dr. Gloria Lanson-Billings, there's a picture of her there in front of you. And she is the conceptrice of culturally relevant pedagogy. So how did this all start? She was doing research in the 1990s using an asset-based approach, looking at teachers and students who were thriving and while surviving in school districts in the United States where teachers and students were saying Black students were unable, unwilling, and unfit. She did this ethnographic inquiry on teachers who were from various social identities to understand what exactly were they doing with their learners in their communities, because they were ensuring that Black students were academically successful despite the anti-Black conditions in the school system and in the society at large. So Lanson-Billings followed these teachers very closely, and she distilled what she observed as sort of commonalities between these teachers. And those commonalities that she observed, she coined as culturally relevant pedagogy. So in one of her seminal articles that I encourage you to read, it's called Culturally Relevant Pedagogy, but that's just good teaching, which was a response from an elementary teacher when she presented this research in the early 90s after it was done. And a teacher just got up and said, but that's just good teaching. And here are the tenets of this pedagogy. So she observed that these teachers were holding high expectations for all students. And I like this quote from Rabindranath Tagore, who was a Bengali poet, who said, "Don't limit a child by your own learning, by your impressions of what they can achieve," because she was born in another time. She very much saw that these teachers believed that their students could achieve and set those conditions for them to do so. She noted that the teachers were recognizing, valuing, honoring, and nurturing, and learning from student cultural competence. And finally, Lanson-Billings observed that the teachers were developing a critical cultural competence. So good teaching of intercultural understanding and awareness in a French as a second classroom reflects closely these tenets. So we're going to take a second to look at the intercultural competence model by Michael Byram, and also the French as a second language curriculum. And then we're going to try to put all three of these concepts together to help us see the way forward. So what you're looking at here is a diagram of a model of the intercultural communicative competence proposed by Dr. Michael Byram and colleagues. It was developed as a part of the Council of Europe's project to construct a common European framework of reference for languages, the CFR, as we all know. The model of intercultural communicative competence outlines the key components: the savoir, savoir comprendre, savoir s'engager, savoir être, savoir apprendre et faire. And this model came out decades ago, and it's been interpreted in many different ways. But basically, it's showing us how intercultural attitudes, knowledge, critical awareness, and skills that language learners should develop in order to become mediators of diverse identities and cultural groups. So we don't have the time to get into too much detail about what each one of these ICC aspects are. But in the interest of time, I just want to draw your attention to the savoir-être, where Byram and colleagues describe that as a key component to developing a sound intercultural competence, where one must be curious and open, ready to suspend disbelief about other cultures and belief about one's own. Even though Byram's model of intercultural communicative competence demonstrates some interest in equity in education and an anti-oppressive framework, we want you to keep in mind, and we're inspired by the work of Dr. Paul Gorski, who's an equity and justice educator in the States, who suggests that we have to be wary of culture-centric frameworks that may be implemented in ways that essentialize marginalized students and communities and mask the forms of structural injustice that feed educational outcome disparities. So I'm not sure if you see right now some of the interconnectedness between the intercultural communicative competence model that I just showed you, the tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy, and what all of that has to do with the FSL curriculum. Well, let me tell you something. We're going to talk about it during our breakout rooms and our discussions, but I'll give you some hints. So if we take the first two tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy, that being holding high expectations for all students and also taking advantage of student cultural competence, I think that a teacher who holds closely those two aspects of CRP, they will find themselves positioning students, setting the conditions for and supporting students in the necessary ways with an intent that learners will experience success consistently in French in their classrooms. I believe that success begets success. I believe that if we do lots of formative assessment and create conditions that have students moving along and improving iteratively, we will see students become more motivated, more engaged in French learning. I remember going to a workshop where former football player Orlando Bowen, and now motivational speaker and educator, said, we have to raise the bar high, but then we have to set those conditions to lift the students off the floor to reach the bar. And I believe that's what should inspire us when we talk about not just holding high expectations, but creating the conditions for students to make them. We have to harness student cultural competence and use student experience as a vehicle for learning. In an FSL classroom, what could that be? That could be the integration of family and community knowledge in learning and translanguaging if you have plurilingual students. And I love this quote at the bottom by Dr. Sharon Lapkin and Meryl Swain, with whom I worked with in 2000. They say in one of their articles that L1 is not always the enemy, particularly because L1 is part of the student's social identity. We could use L1 as a resource. And they said to insist that no use be made of L1 in carrying out tasks that are both linguistically and cognitively complex is to deny the use of an important cognitive tool. So we have to be strategic. We have to approach our teaching like a researcher, where we're looking for iterative improvement, where we're using all strategies at our disposal in order to scaffold learners to become better communicators in French. The last tenet of culturally relevant pedagogy is supporting a critical cultural consciousness. So what is that? As teachers of language, we cannot avoid this essential part of culturally relevant pedagogy. And believe it or not, when I observe teachers in my various contexts, once when I was an instructional leader, but also as a course director, this is the aspect of culturally relevant pedagogy that unfortunately teachers often ignore. In Michael Byram's writing, he proposes that all language teaching should promote a position which acknowledges respect for human dignity and equality of human rights as the democratic basis of social interaction. But similarly, Dr. Lanson Billings notes that a culturally relevant classroom, students need to develop a socio-political consciousness that allows them to critique the social norms, values, and mores and institutions that produce and maintain social inequities. So as an FSL educator who uses CRP to teach, you support learners in developing an intercultural competence that will serve to extend students' existing thoughts about culture. You have to be critical of your own assumptions, as Cecile suggested, about cultures, in particular, limiting and essentializing French cultures, student potential, and what students have to offer to the experience of learning French. FSL teachers in particular need to put into question their own biases, beliefs, and value systems regarding the varieties of French, not favoring one variety over another, but rather creating opportunities for students to see these varieties in context, but using always an anti-oppressive lens. Unfortunately, our current French as a second language curriculums in Ontario have gaps. They do not adequately or specifically address critical consciousness in the intercultural understanding expectations. The curriculum asks us to teach students to learn aspects of culture in diverse French-speaking communities around the world, but they don't ask us as educators to stimulate the development of a mindset to make sense of the social and political contradictions and tensions that exist and that students will confront. That would be developing a critical cultural consciousness. So when we do our varied activities that focus on contexts where French is being used as the language of communication, for example, like the francophonie, but it could be anywhere locally in your neighborhood or in your area or in your region, in the province, it's essential that we contextualize all perceptions and perspectives of those spaces, historical, social, political, and economic. When talking about culture, we mustn't avoid important concepts of equity literacy, like French colonial history and stories of resistance and resilience, cultural and linguistic imperialism, French as a language of oppression and of preservation in Canada, dominance, survival, privilege, bias, social identity, and intersectionality, knowing that these concepts support learners in developing an intercultural critical consciousness. Our French as a second language students need to approach culture, theirs and others, with a critical lens so as to develop effective intercultural awareness and skills. So it is a mindset of doing. One of the key aims of the intercultural dimension of language teaching as proposed by the Council of Europe is to develop intercultural speakers or mediators who are able to engage with complexity and multiple identities and to avoid the stereotyping which accompanies perceiving someone through a single identity. It's based on perceiving the interlocutor as an individual whose qualities are to be discovered rather than as a representative of an externally ascribed identity. So we want to take some time to let you talk and to keep in mind some questions when addressing intercultural understanding in your program. And so what we're going to do, Cecile and I, is we're going to take these questions and we're going to pop them into the chat. I'm just going to take a look at our time here. I think we're okay. We have about 20 minutes. And I'm also not sure how many of us we are. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can actually see how many we ended up being. We're 41. Good.
Fantastic. So Karen, I've already posted, oh, we've just lost somebody. We're at 39, a couple of folks. That's okay, that's okay. Still really impressive numbers. I've just posted some questions already in the chat that perhaps can serve as the basis for discussions when we put you in your breakout room. So take a look at the chat. You don't have to answer all the questions. Obviously, they're very heavy, some of them are a little bit lighter. But we want you to start talking to one another, talk to your colleagues. What are their thoughts? What are some issues that you're currently grappling with in the FSL curriculum in terms of intercultural awareness? What are some of the things that we talked about today? If you want to go off script and you don't want to follow the questions in the chat, that's okay too. But if you want to talk about some of the things that were brought up today in the presentation that you thought were interesting, why not? Let's use this opportunity to connect and to see what other folks are saying.
Can I just mention here, Cecile,
yes.
and we forgot to say, OMLTA has been amazing and partnered with the Ministry of Education to put together various modules. I'm sure that's how you found us, but one of the modules is actually focusing on just this topic we're talking about today. And inside of these modules, we'll have also lots of links for you to find out more and to delve further into some of the issues that we've addressed today.
Thank you. That's an excellent point, because there's a lot of layers here that need to be unpacked. All right, so I'm creating the breakout rooms. Please look in the chat to pick and select and go through some questions, or if you're not interested in any of those questions, just get a conversation going. And it's currently, I've got 7:34, I have 7:40. So why don't we give each other about 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes to talk. Karen and I, if you don't mind, we're just gonna pop in and see how things are going. And then we'll come back for the last 10 minutes or so of tonight's gathering, just to get some feedback and to hear what you have to say as a larger group. Okay? Alors, bonne conversation et on se retrouvera dans à peu près une quinzaine de minutes. D'accord? Okay.
Well, just before we boucle un petit peu la soirée là, we wanted to hear, some of what you talked about in your groups, something that you are going to come away with, something maybe you're going to work on, something that touched your spirit. We'd love to hear from you.
I will be brave. We talked about, it's a little hard to avoid the pandemic, increasing the gaps in student knowledge. So people coming from big school boards where the core French teacher was removed to support elsewhere, and attendance issues and things like that just have increased the gaps, so that the importance of meeting students where they are and helping them grow. It always has been important, and it's more so.
I was in the same group as Gabrielle, and I would like to just add on to what she was saying and say that it speaks to the disrespect for the importance of French. And in addition, I know it's functional, I get it, but it also does not speak to it speaks to what the real opinion of the language, and we don't talk about that much.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you think of the hierarchy of subjects, and sometimes French seems to fall towards the middle or the bottom in some places and spaces. And absolutely, it can be demoralizing. It can be upsetting, particularly when you are so passionate about your subject area and you want to really transmit your enthusiasm for French as a second language. But I think opportunities like tonight are amazing. The fact that we were able to connect, that we were able to speak to one another and just hear, what are our challenges, but also what are our triumphs, because we always want to stay grounded in the fact that we are still moving, we're still teaching, we're doing all the things to really, as Karen said, maximize student success. So I think as tough as it may be, building those communities of trust within, our own FSL community, and working, collaborating, being open to learning, challenging ourselves, staying current as much as we can, looking for innovation and creation in everything that we do. That's the essence, that's the art of FSL teaching and learning. So I really appreciate your comment. Do we have time for one more?
I think that we could, if you want one more, and then I think that we could wrap up.
Yep.
Following that.
Okay, sounds good. We have time for one more. I see a message in the chat by Jen Browning, so I'm going to share it if that's okay. So Jen says, it's so nice to connect to peers and affirm your experiences and struggles in the classroom happening to others as well. Thank you so much for this comment, very powerful. So I think we're going to wrap it up unless, no, last chance. Okay. I think we're all tired. So on behalf of myself and Karen, we want to thank you all for coming out tonight. Not an easy session, lots of questions, you know, that discomfort and that ambiguity is really part of the work. So we thank you for that. We look forward to connecting with you in the spring. I think Karen and I might do another presentation. And also, as Karen mentioned, we do have a viewer's guide that's going to be coming out soon. That's going to be part of a webinar series. So you can get all that good stuff that we talked about tonight to really deepen your understanding of FSL and intercultural awareness. Alors, merci beaucoup tout le monde et bonne soirée.
Bonne soirée.
Thank you very much, Karen and Cecile, and to all of our participants.
Merci, bonsoir.
Merci, merci à toi.